So the jaw picks up right where we left off with the brow and the cheekbone. We remember this triangular shape that the zygomatic made in here, right? Well, the jaw is right underneath that. This entire region, this entire broad region is the jaw. And the thing I love about the plane of the jaw is it is simply the side plane of the box. Remember, the head is like a box. This jaw is the side plane. And we can see in the nice lighting setup we have here, it's just all in shadow. The other cool thing about the jaw is, like, rhythmically, it shares this contour with the cheekbone. The cheekbone's being up here, but the cheekbones kind of terminate at this line. The jaw is where it picks up on the side here. So it's very related to the cheekbone. It's a good follow-up to the cheekbone chapter. There is a little bit more complexity to the jaw. If I turn the Asaro head around, there are a few planes in here that, undulate direction and change up things a little bit. However, and we'll look at them, of course, there's also some skeletal anatomy of the jaw. The mandible is under here, which we'll look at that as well. It's a very important player in the jaw. But despite any intricacy that we get into, the jaw is simply a flat plane. It is this beautiful, broad, flat plane that comes in following the contour, the lower contour of the zygomatic, contour of the cheekbone, coming in and, kind of terminating around, somewhere around the corner of the mouth. That side plane cuts right in here. It's a simple and effective plane, critical for constructing the head. So let's dig in and look at it. All right, so on the left, we have a beautiful painting by Dan Gerhartz, and on the right, we have a skull diagram by Andrew Loomis. We're looking straight at the jaw plane here. Now, the jaw is actually a series of planes, just like the brow and the cheek area was. But before we get into the series of planes, the main thing to understand is it is a pretty flat side plane of the head. More or less, this is just one thing. Now, I don't want to speak too soon. There is some complexity to the jaw that we'll dig into, but let's understand it first as simply as we can. Now, when I think about the jaw plane in my own illustrations and paintings and drawings, I like to have it intersect the chin a little bit. I group the jaw plane in with the chin. It might be tempting to think of it more like this, but I think it's better to kind of have it cross near the corner of the mouth and come down to the chin, because this is all the side of the head. You can see this rhythm on our Asaro head. It's kind of the same sort of thing. It comes down, intersecting roughly where the corners of the mouth are. And these planes point to the side. And before we explore more of that, I want to make it clear that the jaw has one big break in direction. It's right in here. The corner of the jaw is here. As you can see, conveniently located at the halfway point horizontally. So if we were to draw the same plane on the skull here, it's kind of like this, defined by the zygomatic, the top line defined by the zygomatic bone, and we come down around here. The bottom contour of the jaw, which I have not drawn yet, on her goes here. We find this corner right in here, and the jaw comes up. So again, this corner here, we draw to that, and it comes up, literally following this jawbone. Now, of course, the jaw is a movable element on our skull. It's a hinge joint. If I were just to move this Photoshop rotation point, it just hinges right there. So the jaw, moves like this. We'll talk a little bit about how the face moves. This is not a class about that, but we'll get into a few tips and tricks later on. But in terms of the movement of that plane, it's very straightforward. Let's go back to our swimming friend here and just notice how the jaw looks in perspective. I'll just redraw this plane on the left here. We're looking at the jaw pretty straight on from the side. And let's use our orange marker to identify that angle change, which is very obvious. And I apologize, let me just bring back the skull for just a second. Notice that angle, it's very close to 90 degrees. It's just a little greater than 90. But again, you might have different angles with different models, but it's something just over 90 degrees. It's pretty squarish. All right, so back to where we were, we can see that angle represented in the front view as well. Now, the thing I wanted to show you, though, is just how the shape of this jaw, this one plane that we're simplifying it down to here, changes in perspective. If I were to draw it on him, I would follow the side plane of the cheekbones, like we just looked at this part, right? I'd follow the same contour, except this time we'll go down this way. Maybe just tuck it under like that. And then let's just trace the literal contours of the head to finalize our jaw plane here. And when I turn the opacity of the photo reference down, I just want you to look at what perspective does to the plane. Obviously, when we're drawing the jaw from a front view, it's foreshortened. The jaw is coming out toward us. So this nice, clear, sort of boxy or squarish shape, turns into a more diamond shape. Can you see how it's diamond-like? If I drew like more of a graphic diamond, that's what the jaw kind of looks like from the front view. Again, perspective plays with these shapes, and your artistic homework when you study is to notice how these simple shapes morph in perspective. That's what experience will give you. Hopefully what I'm giving you in this lesson is like a propulsion or jumping off point, maybe showing you the path to go searching on. That's what my goal is here. Directing you to the very important information. Comparing this jaw plane to the same view with the Asaro head, we can see it's the exact same shape, that diamond-like shape. And remember earlier I drew that arrow that went like this? You notice that arrow doesn't point straight out, it points down slightly. The jaw is angled downwards a little bit. This is in stark contrast to the cheek plane, which essentially pointed up. The jaw points in an incredibly different direction, which of course is why it's responsible for the side plane of the head. But the plane separation here between front and side is great. This is why, obviously, the Asaro head is quite valuable as a tool for artists learning how to draw and understanding the head. It emphasizes these directional changes. When you look at a human model like this, it's perhaps a little bit harder to see this really important and vast change in direction between these two planes. I mean, hopefully you can see it now because I'm showing it to you, but an appreciation for this is something that only comes with study like we're doing here. I apologize for the low-res photo, but this is an absolutely gorgeous sculpture from Disney's Mulan. The character design teams on animated films often use sculpture as a way of teaching the animators how to draw these planes very simply. And just look at this beautiful plane of the jaw. Coming down, and again, just a bit greater than a 90-degree angle as it sweeps around and hits the side of the chin. You notice I'm using a bit of a curved line there. This is something that can change too. Sometimes you'll see it more straight, sometimes you'll see it more, with a slight bow to it. But despite that, this plane will always be nice and relatively flat. And I just want to remind you that the contour here shares the contour with the cheekbones. This line is exactly the line I would have drawn if I were defining the cheekbones. In a perspective like this, on the other side of the jaw, it's still that diamond shape, but this is even more foreshortened, so it's an even tighter diamond shape. You can see the diamond, right? When you squish a square shape into perspective, that's a tongue twister. When you squish a square shape into perspective, it becomes diamond-like. All right, we say hello to Brangelina again, and here's a skull. Ooh. Sorry. I want to add the next step of complexity to the jaw planes, because remember, it is more than one plane, unfortunately, and that brings along some subtlety that we need to understand. Firstly, though, let's just remind ourselves how that jaw plane sits over top of the skull. We're looking at the skull in a slight three-quarter view, so again, that diamond shape is starting to happen. I think this is pretty simple to understand. So let's look at the next piece of this. Remember when we did the cheekbones, we had this plane here that pointed up? Well, the bottom of the zygomatic bone points slightly down. So there is a change of direction here. And because this ridge is superficial or subcutaneous, that ridge will show up on people. Not just thin people, it shows up on everybody. It's subcutaneous, it doesn't change from person to person. And for that reason, it's a great landmark. But looking at this part of her jaw here, can you sense that subtle change of direction? This is cheekbone facing up. That is the underside of the zygomatic, or jaw, facing down. The dividing line would be right in the middle and coming down here, as we know. In fact, on this particular photo, you can almost see an invisible line. Can you see that kind of invisible line defining the side plane of the jaw? Actually, Andrew Loomis, in one of his books, said that he recommends studying from magazine models. Of course, this is back in the 60s, whenever it was written, where magazine models was more of a thing than it is today. But the whole idea is studying from beauty photos is a great way to learn the planes of the head because, as I said before, we attach a great beauty to clear planes. All right, the other thing about this particular change in direction, this tiny little plane here, it's only really evident right in here. If you remember, this part of the skull is not subcutaneous. You cannot feel these bones directly under the surface. You have to push your flesh in to hit this bone here. So for that reason, this part is more fleshy. Now, there are planes here that we have not talked about yet, and I will. They kind of intersect with the skull. We'll get there, don't worry. For now, just ignore that and know that the sharpness happens here and it's softer there, okay? Next up on our tour of the jaw is this very important bone called the mandible. The mandible is this entire bone, obviously wrapping all the way around to the other side. But right now I'm interested in this little piece of it. And not only the physical piece there, but I'm also interested in the lack of bone that exists here. We've already looked at the potential for a slight hollowing effect to happen here, because there's really no bone for a support. It's kind of this cavity that just goes in. And sometimes you will see that hollow effect. Not always. This is sometimes covered up, but we can see it here on this model. But where the mandible is, this is where the jaw rounds back out. So we have the hollow coming in this way, the mandible causing this rounding out that way. I'm exaggerating the plane difference here. The Asaro head, and I've flipped this horizontally, this is the complex side corresponding with this. I just flipped the image so it aligns with our skull. The Asaro head shows us this. It shows us the hollow, and then you can see that plane come back out right where the mandible bone would be. Going back to our human model here, I don't know about you, but I can kind of see that bone if I'm looking for it, because I know it's there now. I can kind of see it. Or maybe what I should say is I can see evidence of it. I can see the plane change that gives you the mandible in this area. Now, don't mistake me here. This bone is not subcutaneous. However, this part of the jaw is. This is where the bone touches the skin. Again, feel it on your own face. You can feel that bone right under the surface right there. So there's a big hollow here, but we need that bone to touch the flesh here. So it's got to build itself back out. And you get this kind of lumpiness sort of thing happening in the lower jaw region. But the story does not end there. Let's bring up this diagram. This shows you some of the muscles of the head. Obviously, the mandible would be somewhere here, but if you notice, it's buried. It's buried under this gigantic muscle called the masseter muscle. This is the chewing muscle. If you just mimicked a chewing motion with your own jaw right now, put your hand, roughly right there, you can feel this muscle flexing as you chew. And because we humans tend to have to eat a lot, that muscle is very developed. In fact, I gained my respect for this muscle not from studying humans, but from studying horses. This is the masseter muscle on a horse, the one in red here. Obviously, a horse's jaw is much more powerful than ours, and this is the star of the show, this gigantic masseter muscle. And yeah, ours is right there. Kind of lays over the mandible like this. It's a little larger than the actual bone itself. And yes, there is another muscle beside it where the hollow is, but even this muscle still gives the opportunity for a hollow. It's not nearly as big, doesn't push out. You can see in this diagram, doesn't push out as far as the masseter. That little muscle is called the buccinator, by the way, which I take personal pride in. Anyway, the way the Asaro head depicts this is that there's a plane here, which roughly attaches there, a plane here, and down. And the direction of these planes go like this. This goes down, this goes out, and this goes down. Here it is on the actual Asaro head. You can see these planes like this. Down, out, down. You might be wondering what this triangular plane is here. It's a bit odd to me. I've always found it odd that it's triangular because there's nothing really triangular about this region in the skull. Far be it from me to question the great John Asaro. I usually think of the head as a square plane. I do think there is a plane there though, because the jaw does change direction. Bringing back this guy here, you can kind of see that plane going this way backwards, then ever so slightly it cuts at a slightly increased angle toward the chin. If I were to draw some arrows, this plane faces this way, this plane faces that way. It's just the slightest turn. Here is a fantastic model that demonstrates all the possible complexities of the jaw. Now again, this is a very lean face, which means we're going to see all the little undulations at their maximum level of expression. I think most people you see walking around day to day probably don't have this level of definition in their jaw. Now, these things are always there. It's just that they can be masked by many factors. One common one is how lean you are. So just to recap, let's get the overall shape of the plane here. And right away, you might be like, oh, you're too far from the corner of the mouth. There are planes here that we're going to talk about later that also affect, that kind of intersect with the jaw. So don't worry, we'll get there. But, I got this diamond shape, right? The same diamond shape we discovered right at the beginning of this section. I've got this plane here that goes downwards. We've got this squarish plane of the mandible that's going back toward the ear, this direction. This little plane that juts out in this direction. And then the plane that brings us to the bottom part of the mandible, which is subcutaneous, which goes in this direction. So that little jaw gets quite complex with everything in. The good news is, like I said, you probably won't have to paint it like this or illustrate it like this that often. Most of the time, it's just a relatively flat plane. I say relatively flat because it still has some roundness. But one thing you'll always see is this diamond shape. Remember the jaw breaks right about there. I say breaks, it changes direction, this angle we looked at. And essentially all that complexity we just saw is just not present here. This is just one sort of flat or relatively flat plane. Now we'll talk about light and shadow later in this lesson, but the shadow side of his face is beautiful because the shadow literally traces that plane. Let me undo that. Can you see the shadow line? If I just trace that shadow line, the light gives us this plane. And why is that? Well, say it with me. The jaw is the side plane of the head. And again, it's just this relatively flat plane on him. I feel weird saying him. That's Martin Luther King, man. The jaw planes on Edward Norton here have a little bit of that complexity. You can see a slight dip and then a slight recovery as it comes out to meet the jaw. But for the most part, it is fairly flat as well. So again, it's important to know the simple explanation for things, which is how I always start these sections, right? The simple, shape of the jaw plane, as if it were just one plane. And then we break it down. So all of this can be put into your own illustrations, portraits, designs. Do you want it simple? Do you want it more complex? Whatever fits the mood that you're trying to do. Okay, now there is an important variant I have to cover, and I'm gonna dip back into the cheekbone section because this has everything to do with the mandible and masseter muscle in combination with the zygomatic bone. This diagram will help me intro it. This frontal edge of the zygomatic bone is quite prominent. It's subcutaneous, as we know. The mandible is also quite a substantial bone, and the masseter that lays on it is such a substantial muscle. Sometimes these two things or three things work in concert, and you get a rhythm that runs down the face like this. This is a bit vague, so let me just show you a photo. Here on Khabib Nurmagomedov, you can see it happening. Starting with the zygomatic here, which we can kind of pinpoint right there. The masseter muscle would be somewhere in here. You can see that these planes link, and there is this rhythm of a line that cuts down. This is a variant, and it links the front plane of the cheeks with the side plane of the jaw in kind of a different arrangement. In this arrangement, the big front plane of the cheek, like we explored in the previous section, is different. It's not doing this. Instead, it's cutting down like that and going all the way down in this pattern. You often see this on lean faces because when a face is lean, the subcutaneous parts really stick out. At least they have the effect of sticking out more because there isn't enough fat content to, patch it up, I guess. Here's a different photograph of Khabib, same guy. You can see that dramatic plane change coming right down, creating this. It's still a beautiful rhythm. It's got this nice arcing motion to it, but it is a significant break from what we saw in the cheekbone section. And I debated whether or not to include this in the cheekbone section or the jaw. I decided to put it here because now that we know both of these parts of the head, I can just kind of plug this in. You can look at it on the other side. It's just this nice rhythm that comes down. It's almost like racing stripes or something. But speaking of the cheekbone, keep in mind that even when your model does have this, that front plane of the cheek, the one that points up, is still there. Like these planes still point up from the cheek. It's just this connection from the cheek planes to the jaw that are altered. In fact, there's a whole alternate version of the planes of the head. This is not an Asaro head. I don't think John Asaro sculpted this head. I believe this comes from some kind of Russian school. And this head shows this rhythm. Notice the dramatic plane change of the zygomatic bone right in here as we turn from the side of the head to the front. That plane change is really dramatic, and it creates this rhythm down like this. If you look at it from the front view, you can see what's happening. It's just that there is a dramatic change in direction here that is simply not shown in the Asaro head. The Asaro head gives us more of a flow to it, whereas this is a hard plane change. From my experience, this is less common to see than this. Best I can say is you should look out for both. What I also love about this alternate sort of plane of the head, I love that it really dramatically shows the down angle of the zygomatic bone. It also does not have that triangular plane of the Asaro head. It has the boxy plane. This is kind of more in line with how I see the head. Looking at it from the front view, we get that hollow here. We get the plane jutting out here. We get the underside of the jaw as it meets the bottom where the bone is subcutaneous. We get all these plane changes beautifully in this head model. We also get that side plane of the mandible, pointing this way versus the rest of the jaw pointing this way as it turns around. So our simple little jaw got quite complex by the end. Feel like we went through a journey with this one. And to complete that journey, let's do a few drawings. Starting with this one from the last section. We've gone from brow to cheeks to now jaw. Let's get rid of what we blocked in earlier. We can do this more accurately now. First thing I want to do is kind of landmark where the bottom of the head is. Now, I haven't talked yet about overall head proportions. I will do that. Like I said in the intro, I'm kind of doing this lesson a little bit differently. But I'm going to ballpark the chin somewhere there. I'm also going to ballpark where the back of the skull is. That will give me my center line, which, as we know, is where the jaw hinges. Probably somewhere around here. All right, let's just extend that plane down, extend this plane down to give us something. The ear seems pushed a bit too far back now that I've got the back of the skull figured out. It's more like in this range. We'll draw down, get that break in direction, come in, that little loop right in there, meeting the side of the chin. And then immediately we'll go over to our other side of the head, and we'll get this very compressed diamond shape that we remember for the other side of the skull. I'll just throw these in shadow to indicate that these are the side planes. Of course, the zygomatic points up, so let's respect that. And let's just throw this brow plane in shadow just for consistency. And for the very first time in this class, we have essentially a completed head, minus the features, of course. Well, I guess the top of the head as well. But structurally, the head is there. My center line might do well to move in just a little bit. There we go. I find the more information you add to a drawing, you can check your other information against it, right? If I wanted to get a bit more complex with this and find those other planes, I'd probably want to start with the mandible, which is a pretty thick plane that has the direction like this, using my red marker to go cross contour with it. This plane, as we know, meets the bottom side of the mandible and starts turning under, and that kind of just tucks in there. And then I can just put in this direction. Actually, let me put that closer to here with this direction of a plane that goes down as the front-facing cheekbone changes to the side-facing jaw. I can fill in these planes if I wanted to, just with some dark lines. And we know that this plane goes in that direction. The other thing I could do to address that variant is find the front plane of the zygomatic, trace it down rhythmically like this to that masseter muscle, which would overlay across the mandible like this. I'm kind of ruining my other drawing that's beneath this, doing two drawings for the price of one here, but this would address that kind of variant we looked at. All right, this is a new one that I roughed in. I even put that lighter value here to indicate the cheekbones, the plane that points up. First thing I want to do is, again, indicate where the bottom of this head probably is. I've already mapped out the center line of the skull here. I happen to know that it exists beneath the mouth. The break-in plane is there, the break-in direction, I should say. We'll talk about those kind of measurements a little bit later, but for now, I can probably ballpark it to happen right in there, and I'll draw a little checking line over to indicate the same thing over here. Then from here, let's just work our way down from the center line. Hit that change, come in here, finish up our jaw plane, mirror it this way. The chin is there, and for the jaw, thinking about that diamond shape. Now don't do this, don't connect it here. That's too short, that's too pushed in this way. The jaw does not connect to the cheekbone. What I've just done there is this. I put a line like that. That's wrong. It's a very common mistake. Do not do it. The jaw connects out here, the center line of the skull. And let's just throw these side planes into tone as we've been doing. If I wanted to find the mandible here, I could do it. It's there, and I like to put in these little cross contours to show me the direction. Show me the direction. And there's this curving action as it meets the underside of the jaw. Mandible here, it's quite a thick bone. And coming down this way. Coming down this way where it eventually meets the chin area. Extend our center line down to complete this. And there we go. Once again, a head that looks sound, constructionally speaking. I'm not sure if constructionally is a word. All right, looking at a dramatic down angle. Tricky part is to find probably where that directional change will be. Again, these little landmarks help because when I draw a little landmark like that, my brain kind of fills in the line. You could also, of course, just do like practice lines and then undo. Or if you're doing this in pencil, just get an eraser. Maybe this landmark needs to come in just a little bit. Come down, get the change in direction, get that. Again, you can check your angle, right? Make sure this is in perspective, so it's a bit skewed, but a little over 90 degrees. From this angle, we will not see a jaw here. It's too steep of an angle. You won't see it. So from here, this just becomes the contour, meets the chin directly. Bring this plane down. But wait, you know what? Before we do anything, this angle is bugging me. It's too close to 90 degrees. It needs to be out more. Just a little bit out, something like this. Also, my center line there was off. That needs to be more like that. All these little corrections I'm totally not afraid to leave in the video. I don't get things perfect right away, and I don't think many people do. Unless all you do day in, day out is draw the head, you're probably going to have to make little corrections like this as you go. This is also why it's important to not start putting in the features, the eyes, nose, and mouth and stuff, because if your structure is off, those things will just never land in the right place. And it's so easy to redraw a center line or redraw a jaw line. Much more cumbersome to redraw an entire nose. Anyway, I'll keep this last plane simple. The last thing I just want to do here is understand its direction. Remember, it points slightly down, and because this head is already tilted down, it points down a little more. Again, we looked at it here on the Asaro head. The plane does not point straight horizontally. It points slightly down. This jaw might even go a little further down because of the tilt of the head. And I'll just demonstrate that with the cross contour showing that direction of the plane. Again, back on the Asaro head, going this way with the plane versus, say, the side of the brow, which has that tilt that goes up this way. Planes are a study of the change of direction, both big and small. All right, I think that'll do it for the jaw. Let's move on to the next piece.